皆様、本日は足元の悪い中、朝早くからお集まりいただきどうもありがとうございます。定刻となりましたので、愛知大学国際研究機構第4回研究フォーラム、ハーバード大学のアジア研究を、開催したいと思います。私、本日、全体の進行を担当させていただきます、愛知大学経営学部の田中と申します。それでは、本日のご司会は、愛知大学国際研究機構長の、佐藤元彦先生でございますので、佐藤先生ではよろしくお願いいたします。
皆様おはようございます。それでは、10時になりましたので、本日の国際研究機構主催の、第4回の研究フォーラムを始めさせていただきたいと思います。国際研究機構でございますけれども、愛知大学には6つの国際系の研究機関がございまして、それのいわばアンブレラ組織といいますか、コンソーシアムといいますか、そういう性格のもので、この間、大学の方針として、6つの構成機関同士の共同的な取り組み、共同研究を促進するようにと、そういう方針が示されておりますので、それに基づいて、今回のような研究フォーラムを開催をさせていただいております。で、本日ですが、正面にプログラムと、それから講師のロブソン先生の、略歴が出ておりますけれども、ハーバード大学アジアセンターのロブソン教授を講師にお招きをして、これから、1時間ぐらいのご講演をいただき、その後で若干の質疑応答の時間をとってという形で考えております。で、なおですね、ロブソン先生は本日の午後のプログラムにパネリストとしてもご参加されますので、午前中のご質問につきましては、技術的な質問、例えば、この言葉の意味は何であるかとかですね、少し聞き取れなかったので、もう一度ここの部分を説明していただきたいとか、そういう内容に限定をさせていただきたいと思います。で、ロブソン先生ですが、実は、ハーバード大学のサマースクールの日本プログラムの責任者を務めておられまして、先月から日本に滞在しておられるというふうに聞いております。とは言いつつも大変お忙しい方なので、わざわざですね、今回愛知大学にお見えいただいたということを、主催者を代表してお礼を申し上げたいと思います。それから本日の企画については、愛知大学教育研究支援財団から、財政的な支援を得ております。そのことについても、心からこの場をお借りしてお礼を申し上げたいと思います。合わせて広報展開において、15万人を要する愛知大学同窓会の皆様にも大変お世話になりました。この点についてもこの場をお借りしてお礼を申し上げさせていただきたいと思います。で、本日ですが、申し込み者ベースでいきますと、会場が200名、それからオンラインで200名ということで、400名の方に申し込みをいただいております。これらの方々にもご参加いただいていることに感謝を申し上げたいと思います。それでは、早速ですが、ロブソン先生にご登壇をいただいて、約1時間でお話をいただきたいと思います。Professor Robson, please, on the stage.
はい。皆さん、こんにちは。ただいま、ご紹介いただきました。ハーバード大学東アジア言語と文明学部、教授と、ハーバードアジアセンターの所長、ジェームズ・ロブソンと申します。よろしくお願いします。この愛知大学、国際研究、傾向と、そして、佐藤元彦教授に対し、ご支援いただき、心から、ありがとうございます。特に今回、李教授には、この素晴らしいイベントの企画と、今日午後に開催される初めてのEzra Vogel記念フォーラムの準備に対して、心から感謝申し上げます。または、 エズラ・ヴォーグル教授の個人図書館、3000冊ぐらいの本を、愛知大学に収蔵していただいてことにも感謝しております。確かに、ヴォーグル教授の忍ぶこのイベントに参加できることは大変な名誉です。彼が最後の講演を行ったこの部屋で話すことができるということは、彼の存在の精神の深く意味のある形で蘇られるものです。この機会をいただきありがとうございます。李教授からは、ハーバード大学におけるアジア研究の歴史について話すように依頼がありました。ヴォーグル教授は、ハーバード大学におけるアジア研究の歴史において重要な役割を果たしていましたが、ヴォーグル教授のハーバードにおけるアジア研究における位置の理解するためには、始まるから始めて、ハーバードにおけるアジア研究の源流と発展について議論しなければなりません。そして、ヴォーグル教授が到着するまでの時代まで含めて考える必要があります。したがって、ヴォーグル教授のよく知られて貢献に焦点を当てているだけでなく、彼のハーバードの活動以前の時代の歴史についても触れ、ヴォーグル以降のアジア研究についても触れさせていただきます。最近、ハーバード大学におけるアジア研究は、社会学科学の視点から現代のアジア社会、政治、経済に焦点を当たっています。しかしながら、ハーバード大学におけるアジア研究は常にそのような状況ではありませんでした。私は東アジア仏教の専門家ですが、それはヴォーグル教授のアジアに関する主な研究領域からは特に思われるかもしれません。しかし、ハーバードにおけるアジア研究の歴史を理解するためには、ここから始まる必要があります。確かに、エズラ・ヴォーグル教授の最後の著書、小さくマスオ教授翻訳しました。そこですか。はい。この本は日中関係史、1500年の交流から読むアジアの未来を読んだ方々は、その本が始まる部分で中国と日本の間に存在した強い文化的なつながれるを提供したコスモポリタンな伝統である仏教についての興味深い議論が展開されていることをご存知ですよ。ヴォーグル教授によれば、アジアを横断する長い歴史の中で、仏教は中国と日本の関係に存在した友好の源泉でした。実際に私が示したいのは、ハーバード大学の初期のアジアの関わりが主に仏教に関連していたということです。李教授が同時通訳を手配してくれましたので、私はここからは英語に切り替えます。Okay, so now we'll switch. So good morning, everybody. So what I'd like to begin with is, may seem a little strange, but I want to begin with Harvard's name in East Asia. As you're no doubt aware, the name in Japanese is Habodo Daigaku. And this is a transliteration based on the sound that is rendered in katakana. But in Chinese, it does not have a separate system for doing this, so they use kanji to express certain sounds. In Chinese, Harvard University is rendered by the compound hafo. Now, most people in Asia even simply accept this transliteration as the sound of Harvard in English. Yet the choice of possible characters to render this name is quite vast. And while the history of how this came about is not entirely clear, when taken literally, It means Laughing Buddha University. Waraobutsu. Yeah. So this is 日本語でそれは笑った時に出す音ですね。そのは。So this is quite interesting, I found, as a Buddhist studies scholar. And so Buddhism is part of Harvard's name. I spent some time trying to find the origin of this name, and the best I could do must have been somebody with a sense of humor. And I found that the earliest account of this name is in reference to the name of the Harvard Medical School in China that was established in Shanghai in 1911 in consultation with local Chinese scholars. So that's the very first time when this term appears. Now, while there's a much longer history of Japan's contact with the West, that goes back to Western missionary history, at least to the 16th century or longer, that was eventually cut off, and Japan entered into a period of isolation. It was, of course, only in 1853 that Admiral Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay, which led to the subsequent opening of Japan to trade and diplomatic relations to the West. 7 years later, in 1860, the Meiji government sent its first diplomatic mission to the United States, and thus began the interchange between the US, including Harvard, and Japan. As far as I've been able to find out, the first Harvard-connected person to visit Asia, indeed Japan, was not a professor or a scholar, but a visit in 1871 of the son of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the famous poet who taught poetry at Harvard. His son, Charles Longfellow, decided, there it is. His son, Charles Longfellow, decided to take a ship to Japan in 1871, and he immersed himself in the culture of Japan. He even wore samurai attire. When he returned to the US, he brought an enormous collection of Japanese artifacts that are now in a place called Longfellow House, just off the Harvard campus on Brattle Street. And quite famously, he came back with many tattoos. Many of the young people in the audience appreciate this. 1871, a fully tattooed body. And notice his, on the front, he has Kannon Bosatsu, a Buddhist image on the front. And on the back, he got in Japan, which is a large carp fish, a koi. And this caused quite a sensation in America with him. It was just a year later, in 1872, that the first two Japanese students arrived at Harvard. Both came as part of the Iwakura mission, the Iwakura Shisetsudan, and they were enrolled in Harvard Law School, earning degrees in 1874. One of them, this one, Inoue Yoshikazu, aspired to a military career upon graduation, but when he returned to Japan, sadly, he couldn't adapt and ended up committing suicide. The other was a much more famous figure named Kaneko Kentaro, who will be known to many of you. He later went on to help draft the Japanese Constitution in 1889. Interestingly, both of them, when they were at Harvard, they were advised by Oliver Wendell Holmes, the future Supreme Court justice. And one of the first Japanese undergraduate students was a figure by the name of Kikawa Chokichi, who graduated with the Harvard class of 1883. And so he must have entered Harvard in 1878. Now, teaching about Asia came later than the arrival of Asian students. Harvard was not the first university in the US to offer Asian language instruction, namely Chinese, but it was the first to teach it. What I mean by that is Yale University was the first American college to offer instruction in Chinese, but nobody showed up for the class. So they tried. Nobody showed up. And that was in 1877. But after raising funds for a position in Chinese language instruction at Harvard, a candidate was found, namely Ge Kunhua. And Ge had spent 5 years working for the British Embassy and 2 more at the American consulate in Shanghai. He did not speak any English, but he was hired and eventually reached Boston with his wife and children in the fall of 1879. He brought with him numerous books which were entrusted to the library. These were the first books in any Asian language to go into the Harvard library system. And those volumes became what grew into the Harvard-Yenching Library, which is a multi-million volume collection, the largest of any library outside of Asia. I'll say more about that in just a minute. In his first year, Ge had only 1 student, but I believe this may be the first course ever offered on Chinese in the United States. His student was a professor of Latin. He had 1 student in the class, so better than Yale, he got 1. And this was professor of Latin. Whoops, excuse me, this is, where's he at? Oh, I don't have the, oh, I'll come back to this. This was his first student, George Martin Lane, who taught him Ge English in return. Now, Ge's time at Harvard, which was originally meant to last 5 years, came to an abrupt and a tragic end only 3 years after his arrival. In the late winter of 1882, he contracted pneumonia, and after a brief battle with the illness, he passed away on February 14th of 1882. Ge was survived by his wife and 6 children, all of whom had accompanied him to Harvard. In the area, funds were raised to finance their return to China and support his children through the completion of their education. In the Boston Daily Advertiser in 1882, they wrote about him. He has had only 4 or 5 pupils. This is during 4 or 5 years of teaching. But the results obtained have been most satisfactory. One who has studied with him has acquired the ability to converse easily with the Mandarins and is nearly ready to establish himself in some business in China. Unfortunately, after Ge died, it would be a full 4 decades before the university offered Chinese again. Now, the first Chinese student to enroll at Harvard was a student by the name of Ding Chongji, who enrolled in 1880. But for some reason, he was forced to return to China after just 1 year at Harvard. After him, the number of students began to grow, and by 1908, they had formed a Chinese student club. And between 1909 and 1929, about 250 Chinese students earned degrees at Harvard. Many went on to distinguished careers in China. Many became, actually, almost half of them became university professors. And at least about a dozen of them became university presidents in China. So very influential group. Now, the story of Japan's connection to Harvard began around the same time. And that is the visit by this figure, Kingo Miyabe, who entered Harvard as a graduate student in 1886. He later became associated with the Arnold Arboretum. That's this botanic garden at Harvard University. The Arnold Arboretum was actually a very important connection point between Harvard and Asia. The first visit to Asia by a Harvard faculty member, at least as I have been able to find, was not by a specialist of Asian history or culture or language, but it was the visit in 1892 by the founding director of the Arnold Arboretum, Charles Sprague Sargent, and his nephew, Philip Codman, who made a journey to Japan to do botanical research and collect plants. They went to collect seeds and plant specimens from Hokkaido and northern Honshu. But perhaps more importantly, they also wanted to see the rich and diverse flora of Japan. Sargent and Codman returned to Boston in December of 1892 with approximately 200 seed collections and 1,225 plant specimens. Sargent was a close associate of James Vetch of a famous British nursery, the Vetch Nurseries. And that led to him hiring a person by the name of Ernest Henry Wilson. Actually, this is the book that Sargent published later on, The Forest Flora of Japan, published in 1939. And this is actually, these are images from the Harvard Arboretum archive. They have a wonderful archive of collections of old photographs of these trips that were made to Japan and the figures in them. So this is Kingo Miyabe, and this is a little record that's kept of him still to this day at the Arboretum. In addition to Kingo Miyabe, there were others, John Jack, this guy here, also taught Chinese botanists who came to Harvard. And this is in 1917 on the grounds of the Arboretum. Now, back to this figure, Ernest Henry Wilson. He made an incredible number of trips to Asia, starting in 1899, and then trips in 1907, 1908, and then finally to Japan in between 1911 and 1916, a big collecting trip. And what he's most famous for is collecting a number of species, but the one I'll focus on, I love this, in the archive, they have a letter that he wrote back to his the director Sargent, but he sent it from the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo on February 13 of 1914, and describes going to Kagoshima and then on to Yakushima. And when he went to Yakushima, he became very famous for research on these very large sugi, cryptomeria trees they call yakusugi. And you can see how big it is if I show you here. That is a person right there. So just massive trees. The one that he became most famous for is this one, where we just have the stump of it left, but you can see how massive it must have been. This is a view from inside the tree, and people like it because it looks like a heart. This tree became known as the Wilson stump, and a lot of people travel there today to see it. The reason why it was cut down was that Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 16th century wanted the wood from that tree to carve a Buddha image for the Hokoji temple in Kyoto, which I was just at last week to see. So so this is so he is the one who found this stump, and it's ever since been known as the Wilson stump, or the Wilson kabu, they call it. So by 1922, the director Sargent had estimated that the trees and shrubs on the grounds of the Arnold Arboretum totaled between 5,000 and 6,000, and about 1,000 of those had been brought newly back from Asia from these trips. And the connections to the Arboretum have continued to this day. When we did a memorial event for Professor Vogel last fall, one of his friends, Hirono Kenichiro, his son, Hirono Yuichiro, it works for the forestry department in Japan. And I spent a day with him at the Arboretum, and now there's an exchange continuing in the study of forestry with the Arnold Arboretum and contemporary Japanese foresters. Now, back on the Harvard campus, it was not just shokubutsu that was being studied, but also butsu and Buddhist history. The first course in East Asian thought was taught in the Department of Philosophy by a professor of Japanese literature and life, it was called. The visiting professorship was organized by Professor James Houghton Woods, who served as the chair of the Department of Philosophy. And he was a specialist of Indian philosophy. He had spent some time in India and then came back to Harvard, and he stayed there until 1934. As the chair, the chair of the new position in Japanese thought was supported by an endowment that was donated by primarily by the most generous donor, William Sturgis Bigelow. This is William Sturgis Bigelow. He had graduated from Harvard and then become very wealthy. And his collection of Asian art forms the collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Wood's interest in Buddhism led him into the study of East Asia, and he later made several trips to Japan during his time as a Harvard faculty member. He actively promoted the development of academic positions dedicated to the study of East Asia and succeeded in securing funds for appointments of two professors, Professor Masaharu Anasaki and another Hattori Unokichi. And it was Professor Anasaki, this one, who taught the first classes on Japanese history and culture ever offered at Harvard, including courses. This is a famous book that he's known for, The History of Japanese Religions. And he also made the newspapers of a Buddhist priest being added to the Harvard faculty. And these were the classes he taught: religious and moral developments of the Japanese with reference to philosophy, art, and literature, and also schools of the religious and philosophical thought of Japan as compared with those of India and China. So these were the first two classes on Japan ever taught at Harvard. And interestingly, his courses were attended by the very famous poet T.S. Eliot, sat in on his courses. I find that fascinating. The first course that was ever dedicated to the subject of Confucian thought, however, were those by Hattori Unokichi. And he taught a number of courses, as you can see, on Confucianism in the period right after, from 1915 to 1916. He had replaced Anasaki and come to Harvard, but when the funding for his salary was finished, then the position was never filled again, and so it was empty. Incidentally, the first major acquisitions of East Asian books after those of Gug Kunhua were from these two Japanese scholars, Professor Inokichi and Anasaki Masaharu. They gave 1,600 books to Harvard before they returned to Japan. And when Anasaki returned to Japan, he began as the chair of religious studies at the University of Tokyo. Around this same time, however, we have in 1912 the beginning of the first course ever in America on Asian art. And this was taught at Harvard by a figure named Langdon Warner. And his work also, he was a collector and also brought a lot of things back from Asia that became part of the Harvard Art Museum collection, including one. So this is he was very famous for his work at the Dunhuang caves, the Tongko Shikutsu. And this is him. In fact, some people say that the films were modeled after him, kind of a swashbuckling figure. But this is a piece, one of the caves at Dunhuang, where he cut out a section of it and brought it to Harvard. And this is as it is at Harvard Museum now, on the second floor of the museum. Very famous story. And this is what it would be like if it was returned. In fact, there's an effort now to try to return that famous piece as a goodwill gesture to China. We'll see what happens with that. In the same year that Langdon Warner began, that was actually the very first visit by Harvard's 21st president, President Charles William Eliot, made a visit to Japan and had a private meeting with the emperor, actually, in 1912. Now, back to this guy really fascinates me, actually. He almost nobody knows of him today. His name is not well remembered, but he was an institution builder, very much like Ezra Vogel was. He was the one who established a permanent chair in Chinese as well. So he started the study of Japan. He also inaugurated the study of Chinese and invited this figure, Zhao Yuanren, in 1922 to teach Chinese. And he also, so he offered the first class in Chinese that was taught after the death of Ge Kunhua 40 years previously. Now, this Woods' most important contribution, though, was securing funds from the estate of Charles Martin Hall, who left a very large sum of money, $6.5 million to Harvard to establish the Harvard-Yenching Institute, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But James Wood, upon his retirement, left for Japan, left Harvard. So he retired in 1934, and he immediately went to Japan to study Tendai Buddhism. He had been impressed by Bigelow, who also was interested in Tendai Buddhism. And in 1933, at the age of 70 years old, James Wood decided to study Japanese with a figure by the name of Hideo Kishimoto, who wrote this Hideo Kishimoto, who wrote about his last trip. Again, this reminds me of Ezra, somebody who studied language all the way till his last days, even taking classes after 70 years old, maybe even increasing them at that time. And so Woods came to Japan in 1934, and he studied with a very famous, actually, this is funny. I like this. In the record, he says, Hideo Kishimoto, the Japanese teacher, said, that this guy showed up in 1933 to attend his course in Japanese language. At first, I couldn't take it seriously. It seemed hardly natural that an aged professor of 70 should be starting a new Far Eastern language. But he evidently became proficient enough. And when he came to Japan, he studied with a very famous Buddhist studies scholar named Yabuki Keiki, who did a very important study, this Meisha Yoin. Meisha is Dunhuang, and I still have my students reading this work today. So Woods showed up in Tokyo, and Yabuki was teaching at Taisho University, and he wanted to study Buddhist philosophy, Tendai philosophy. And so Yabuki gave him courses in Buddhist philosophy. But after only 3 courses, he said that he had no more time to teach him. So Professor Woods smiled, said thank you very much, and said he had reached a supreme point of Tendai, what they call in Japanese kai-e, or revealing the universal. He claimed that he now was a true Tendai Buddhist. And little would he know that those were to be the last words from James Woods. The next day was the 14th of January, 1934. And in the early afternoon, Hideo Kishimoto received a telephone call from Tokyo Imperial University that Professor Woods had died. They performed a Buddhist funeral for him at Asakusa, and the funeral was conducted in a full Tendai Buddhist style. Interestingly, a monument was erected for him at the Onjoji, or Midera, in Otsu, just near Kyoto, where, interestingly, the main person who funded Asian studies at Harvard, Bigelow, also is buried there. His ashes are buried there. And this is also the same site where Ernest Fenollosa, the famous art collector, is also buried there. So for this Midera, Onjoji has a very strong connection between Harvard and Japan. Now, although Woods passed away before the Department of Far Eastern Languages was established at Harvard, he was the one who really provided the institutional and intellectual backing that became the framework for its success. In recognition of his contributions, the first issue of the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, which was published in 1936, was dedicated to him. So this is the very first issue of that journal, very famous journal. So I see him as Harvard's first institution builder of Asian studies, and someone which is his work is later picked up by Ezra Vogel, actually. But who was Hideo Kishimoto? From 1930 to 1934, Hideo Kishimoto had studied at Harvard, and also served as an instructor in the Department of Japanese Studies. So he was the very first person to teach Japanese at Harvard. His own work was done under James Woods, and he went on to then lecture at Stanford and also Princeton. Sadly, hardly anyone remembers him today, but an obituary for him stated, quote, "Professor Kishimoto had an unusual capacity for work with people. His counsel was a constant demand by those concerned with religious studies, as well as, and this is the important part, cultural exchange between East and West." So again, this spirit of trying to create a bridge across East and West sounds very much like the spirit of Ezra Vogel. In a little-known history, however, in 1934, the same year that Professor Woods visited Japan, the Harvard baseball team traveled by boat to Japan to play 10 games with the universities of Keio and Waseda. In fact, Waseda's baseball team had come to Harvard in 1921 to play a game against Harvard. This was the very first sporting event ever against a foreign team. This was really cool to have them come that early on. And in 1934 was also the same year that Babe Ruth visited Japan to big fanfare, lots of excitement about that. But I found in the Harvard archives a little short black and white silent film of the visit of the baseball team in 1934. Oh, this is Hideo. Okay. So this is it. Let's see if I can get it to play. Just wait, I'll tell you. So this is Harvard here. This is Keio. Harvard won that one. They got a trophy. And then this is Waseda, I believe. Yeah, here's Waseda. And Waseda gives Harvard the trophy, even though Waseda won. And that trophy still sits in the athletic department at Harvard University. Now, keep watching for a minute. Oh, it's kind of fun. It's bad footage, but. And then this is the departure when the team was leaving, must have been Tokyo Bay port. All kinds of people showed up with streamers and big goodbye party for them. These are all tied to the boat. There it is, you can see. Really quite amazing reception. Look at that. And then they sailed off. Now, sadly, things deteriorated very quickly after that visit. Indeed, with the outbreak of World War II, the military actually requested this black and white footage to use to learn about the geography of Japan because of the arrival through the sea through Tokyo Bay. And so it ends with a little, and there has never been another joint baseball game between a team in Japan and Harvard. I think it's something, it should be revived as a way of creating a bridge again. And so maybe in the future, there can be an invitation. But basically the Japanese team, the US, they won 6 out of 10 matches. So yeah, but like I said, they were very kind and gave the trophy to Harvard anyway. Now, I had mentioned this figure, Charles Martin Hall, who gave so much money to Harvard. That money was used to establish what's called the Harvard-Yenching Institute. And this was established through the funds from that estate. And it also funded, his money funded the journal, Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies, a visiting scholars program, doctoral fellowships, and basically every faculty member at Harvard until recently was paid with funds from the Charles Hall estate. The institute was formally established in 1928 as the Harvard-Yenching Institute. But before, and so this is the founding document from that. What's interesting, there are some really neat, interesting figures that were important in the lead up to the Harvard-Yenching Institute's founding. And one of them, in the 1920s and 30s, there was a Sino-Indian Research Institute at Peking University that began thanks to the initiative of a figure named Baron Alexander von Stahl-Holstein. And he was at the forefront of the study of Mahayana Buddhism and also Indian religions, and a specialist of the Sanskrit language. He had been invited by Hu Shi to teach Sanskrit and Tibetan at Beijing University. And he was the one who set up a research institute that was exchanging with Harvard. And he came in 1928 as a visiting scholar to Harvard, and helped to establish the Harvard-Yenching Institute and its collection of books. So Chinese scholars from Peking University were also close collaborators of von Holstein, and this was the beginning of a long-term collaboration between Harvard and Peking University, a relationship that carried on with the Harvard-Yenching Institute. And what's important for my comments is that most of the most significant scholars associated with that were scholars of Buddhism. So von Holstein was the first, and then this is the list of the directors. It's only, it's been around since 1928, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 directors. Now the present director is Elizabeth Perry. But the first figure, this figure, Sergei Eliasev, is a very interesting guy. He's the one who started the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies in 1936. But he is technically the founder of the Department of Far Eastern Languages at Harvard, and was the first chair, established in 1937. He was also the very first foreign student to graduate from Tokyo Imperial University, and has been called the first fully trained Occidental scholar in the field of Japanese studies, the first professional Japanologist, learned Japanese very well. In fact, in order to enter, they gave him a test to see if he could pass it, and he did very well. In 1973, Eliasev was the first foreigner to receive the Japan Foundation Award, which Ezra Vogel went on to receive himself in 1996. So the Harvard-Yenching Institute used to be housed in this building on the Harvard campus, Boylston Hall, until they outgrew the space. But this is why people today are curious about this monument here, which is a stele next to Boylston Hall, which was given as a friendship token to Harvard. Now it moved, for those of you who have been to Harvard, it's moved to this building at 2 Divinity, where it also has these 2 lions that were given by Peking University. This is the entrance. The library is here and into the back there. What I want you to pay attention to is to this white marble piece here. So this is the entrance to the Harvard-Yenching Library, and also the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. But what's so interesting is this map that's above the door is a map of the world, because it was originally a geography department. But what's missing on this map? Asia. It's nowhere to be seen. The only thing is cut off is Asia. It stops at India right here. And so I've always found this kind of funny to have the Department of Asian Languages and Civilization in a building with a map where Asia is completely cut off. In any case, this is the home of the Institute today, of the Harvard-Yenching Library, which is a massive collection. This shows the dates of the collections going back to the 1927, only up to 55, when there were 284,000 volumes. Now there's over the current collection is it's actually over 1 million now, but this gives you some information about the relative, mostly largest collection in Chinese, Japanese next, Korean, Vietnamese, and then Western languages, some Tibetan, Manchu, and Mongolian as well. So it's become the major library in the Western world for the study of Asia. So the Harvard-Yenching Institute also sponsors scholars to come to Harvard, and that's one of the major roles that it plays today. It has 50 partner universities in Asia, and it's perhaps one of the leading bridges between Asia and Harvard. And so, and in the Harvard library system, the oldest printed book in the library is a Buddhist text from 975, which is it's a beautiful copy, but that's just a sideline. Here are the visiting scholars. this one from 69 to 70, and this one from 72 to 73. Maybe you'll recognize somebody you know, 83 to 84. The reason why I show this is that in the early years of the Harvard-Yenching Institute, Japanese scholars were very well represented in the group. Over time, however, it's become less and less, and I'm hoping that more Japanese scholars will apply to this program from universities. We need more. It's become heavily dominated by Chinese scholars, and it would be great to have more Japanese scholars. But you can see a lot of names even here: Kobayashi, Masayoshi, and others, Isobe, Takashi, all of those. Okay, so now let's move forward. So that first period of Harvard's history, as I mentioned, was strongly connected to Buddhist studies and also natural studies. But the focus was on traditional sinology, study of languages, Buddhism, and also goodwill exchanges. Not surprisingly, all this changed in the 1940s and with World War II, and then later with the Communist Revolution in China. From this point forward, we see a dramatic shift in the types of courses offered at Harvard, and also an increase in Asian language enrollments. This always happens with enemy. Once you have an enemy, then everybody studies the language. This also saw the time of the birth of the Regional Studies East Asia MA program, this Higashi Asia Chiiki Kenkyu Shushi program. I think, Rick, you were a graduate of that, right? Did you go there to RSEA? Yeah. So this was established at Harvard during this period. And this was the beginning of the collecting of modern and contemporary materials in the library as well. So this was a shift that happened primarily into social sciences, and something that was necessitated due to the increasingly poor relations with Asia. Professor Vogel, in his talk here in 2019, spoke of the deteriorating nature of U.S.-China and Japan-China relations. Indeed, one could say that we've gone backward and are now almost at where we were in the 1960s, if not in some ways worse. As an example of the ill will at the time in the 1960s, I recently was at the offices of the American Council of Learned Societies, the ACLS offices in New York City, and found some interesting materials there. One of them was a report from 1967 when the director had invited a Chinese delegation to come to the U.S. and received this reply from the Chinese. He said, "We, the Chinese people, are very dubious about your purpose and intention. At present, the People's Republic of China has only Mao Zedong thought. All other sects are big poisonous weeds. The aggressive ambitions and schemes of the United States can never be concealed before the devil-finding mirror of Mao Zedong thought. We solemnly warn you that if you dare to play any schemes and tricks, we will certainly smash your dog head." So this was the reply that he got, and shows this was signed the Red Guard team at the Academy of Sciences in Beijing. So during this period, very famously, we have two of the major scholars that come out in the study of Asia at Harvard. One of them is John King Fairbank, who became primarily a scholar of China, his last book was a masterful treatment of Chinese history. And unfortunately, when he delivered that final draft of that book on September 12th, 1991, he had a massive heart attack and then died just a couple days later. But I'll return to him as one of the founders of one of the major centers. And this is him. This is one of his major publications here. And the other figure was Edwin O. Reischauer, who will be probably well known to all of you in the audience here, because he was an important professor at Harvard that taught an important course along with Fairbank. They split it up a semester each. And that was basically the beginning of the modern study of Asia at Harvard. And in 1960, however, he wrote an article about the tensions between U.S. and Japan relations that the U.S. President John F. Kennedy read. And after reading that, he appointed Reischauer as the ambassador to Japan, where he served from 1961 to 1966. After returning to Harvard, he was the main figure in establishing and funding what was called the Japan Institute in 1973. And so these two become the major figures. They published some major, this is his arrival in Japan in the Mainichi Shimbun on his arrival in 1961. And so Fairbank and Reischauer published these massive books about East Asian history that have become quite famous. And they were both important because they were also institution builders. But Reischauer also was the one who had, it's very interesting because he's the perfect pivot figure from this earlier period of studying Buddhism into modern history, because his dissertation was a translation and study of Ennin's diary using an edition from the Toji Monastery that was at the Harvard-Yenching Library, which was published, the two books, 2 volumes, Ennin's diary, published in 1955, and still read very widely today. Buddhism was still carried on a bit later by this figure, a Japanese scholar, Nagatomi Masatoshi, who taught from died in 2000 was basically the very first full-time professor of Buddhist studies at Harvard from 1969 onward. But the most important thing about this period too is we have in the 70s then, this is something I found at the ACLS office, American Council of Learned Societies. This was a delegation to China following the agreement between Nixon and Zhou Enlai in 1972. And right there is Ezra Vogel as part of that delegation. I've just never seen this photograph before, and I thought it was kind of cool. It would be nice. I wish we could go, and it would be great to try to name everybody on this photograph. They didn't have a full list there, but in any case, so Ezra in 1972 then was the one who helped establish the modern Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations when the name was changed from the Department of Far Eastern Languages. And he became the first department chair of that. And this is what the department looks like today. There's about 24 professors, as you can see, specializing on Japanese religions, literature, Chinese history, Korean history, Inter-Asia, Japan, Chinese science, Tibetan Buddhism, comparative literature, art, Korean literature, and then a large number of new faculty teaching film and media studies like anime, manga, Korean drama, Korean pop music, and things like that. That's what it looks like nowadays, though there's still faculty that are teaching the traditional subjects as well. Now, these were the two I mentioned Fairbank and Reischauer were institution builders, and each of them has a center that's named after them. One is the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. It was the Center for East Asian Research, but was renamed, and in 2007 became this full name, the Fairbank Center here. At the founding of it also marked this shift from traditional sinology to more social sciences directions. And Ezra Vogel served as the director twice, from 73 to 75 and then 95 to 99. The Reischauer Institute focuses on Japan, was founded in 73 as the Japan Institute, and has been very active in trying to create this teaching and research about Japan, but also scholarly exchanges between the US and Japan. And then the other important center at Harvard related to Japan is the program on US-Japan relations, founded in 1980, also by Ezra Vogel, and the current director is Professor Christina Davis, who will be here this afternoon for that panel. So here's a figure, Ezra Vogel, who was very instrumental in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilization, building institutions of the centers. But for me, and this is where I'll start to work towards the end of this, is Ezra's work for the Asia, helping to establish the Asia Center in 1997. And so this year and is the 25th anniversary of the founding of the center. And Ezra served as the inaugural director. And the Asia Center is a university-wide center. And from its inception, it has been committed to facilitating the cross-cultural study of Asia at Harvard University by fostering research and bringing together faculty, students, and scholars from all the different schools at Harvard, from the law school to the Kennedy School to the medical school to the Graduate School of Design, all of them. And so Ezra was instrumental working with others to raise the endowment for the Asia Center. And in the early years, these are some of the key figures at that time. Here's Ezra with Ben Minoru Makihara here, and also Masafumi Ishii. And then in this picture with Victor Feng, who's from Hong Kong, as part of that. Here, these are pictures from 1999 at something that was called Asia Vision 21, which Rick, I think you attended all of those. He can say something maybe later today. These were very important meetings that happened every other year, alternating between Asia and Harvard, that brought together important policy leaders, scholars, business leaders to discuss important challenges that Asia was facing. And those were closed door meetings, but had very important discussions that came out of those. And so the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Asia Center here has all of the earlier directors with Ezra Vogel here. This is Bill Kirby, Dwight Perkins, Andy Gordon. This is Arthur Kleinman, Karen Thornber, and Michael Pewitt, who was a temporary director. And so we've, Ezra was very instrumental in setting up the Asia Center, and so we've had different events that have celebrated his life over time there, including this panel when his book China and Japan Facing History came out. Was a wonderful event. And then when Ezra passed away just this past fall, we had a memorial symposium for him. And that's where I'd like to begin to end here. And because most of the figures that I've shown you and talked about today have been figures that were very important in setting up the institutions at Harvard, but most of them have passed away recently. And in that spirit, for my part, what I've tried to do is to bring forward or even fulfill the vision that Ezra had, but had not been acted on seriously. And what I mean by that is, in the founding documents of the Asia Center was a line that read, quote, "The Asia Center should be the entity at Harvard for building up the study of Southeast Asia," end of quote. Ezra was, as usual, ahead of his time and looking into the future. He sensed the rise in importance of Southeast Asian studies, and he knew that if Southeast Asia was going to be important in the future, that Harvard should be actively involved in educating the leaders of the next generation who will have expertise in the languages, histories, and cultures of the region. And while that was an important goal, little progress was made in the first 25 years, despite some attempts to get the initiative off the ground slowly, some talks and some different things. So we formally started a Southeast Asia initiative 3 years ago. And I think this emphasis on that Ezra wanted on to include Southeast Asia at Harvard was validated during this the memorial symposium that we had, where the keynote address, we could actually even say that the turn has been even more important recently when we have President Biden making a trip to attend the ASEAN meeting and then also the G7 meeting in Bali this past fall. And more recently, a lot of news about the U.S. asserting itself on military bases again in the Philippines. And at the Ezra Vogel Memorial, the keynote address was given by the former Singaporean ambassador, Hung Chi-chan, who delivered a keynote address that was Why America Needs an Ezra Vogel for Southeast Asia, which was really great and pointed to the importance of Southeast Asia. And so what I tried to do then since that time in the fall was to start with languages and language specialization, because in fact, the study of Southeast Asia at Harvard is similar to the earliest phase of scholars at Harvard who tried to bring the study of East Asia and the problems they encountered, like what James Wood did to establish a program. And the current status is also not too different from the status of East Asian studies when Ezra became actively involved in the program and had to build institutions. I'm certainly not an Ezra Vogel, but what I learned from him is that if you want to make a bold and substantive change at a place like Harvard that's been around for 400 years almost, you need to change its structure and find new institutional homes for those initiatives. So I and my staff at the Asia Center have been trying to do this with Southeast Asian studies, and started with languages because the mastery of those is fundamental for communication, and communication is essential for addressing misunderstandings. And that is something that Ezra was committed to throughout his entire life, that kind of communication. Therefore, in trying to build this, conversations with the administration to hire the three major Southeast Asian languages, Indonesian, Thai, and Filipino languages, we got no response from the Harvard administration. They wouldn't support it. So I committed $1 million from the Asia Center to pay for those positions, and they immediately said, okay. So money talks. But I also had the hope, and so those searches began, and we actually made those hires this past summer. In fact, I just received news 2 of those have accepted the offers and will be teaching in the fall. So now Harvard will have Thai, Indonesian, Filipino. So Filipino language, Tagalog, is the 4th most commonly spoken language in the United States. English, Spanish, Chinese, Tagalog. It's very surprising to some people. So it has a lot of support for it. Now, interestingly, recall that Yale tried to establish the first Chinese position. After we got these approved, there were newspapers all over the world that were had headlines about Harvard teaching Tagalog and also these other Southeast Asian languages. And Yale News, their student paper, came out, and students call for Tagalog language credit. So I thought that was nice. That here you can see that there are no courses in Tagalog. And then last week, Harvard announced it would have a full-time instructor. So the Yale students then tried to organize to do that itself. So what about institutional home? Very quickly. So this is what Harvard's a very complicated institution. This is what it looks like. So we have Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, about 26 or so faculty. Department of South Asian Studies, Committee of Inter-Asian, this is a committee, not a department. These are the centers: Asia Center, Fairbank, Reischauer, Middle, for South Asia, Korea Institute, and the Davis Center. So where do you put Southeast Asian Studies? Those language positions are actually in the Department of South Asian Studies, which is an insult. And so something has to change. So I've developed a plan that I've given to the deans, which looks something like this. We'll see if they buy it or not. You saw it first here, which is to create a Department of Asian Studies that would then include East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Central, all under one roof. And then each of them would have centers associated with them. Blue is what exists already. Red would be new entities, and it's mainly just reconfigurations. And then the Asia Center would be the one that oversees the study of transnational Asia. So these are ongoing discussions, and I hope something will happen in the future. Now, I wouldn't have ever been so bold to attempt this type of thing, but Ezra, as anybody who knew him could attest, was a humble man. And I probably wouldn't have had the courage or incentive to embark on this project were it not for a comment he once made to me after I asked him for some advice about running the Asia Center. He kept telling me to develop a vision for what he called your Asia Center, which I thought was ridiculous, and which I'm happy to try to build my own vision of that. But my ultimate goal is to return the favor to Ezra and make it his Asia Center. And basically what we have, all of those other centers are named after their founders, Reischauer and Fairbank. And I think it would be most appropriate in the future to name the Asia Center after Ezra Vogel. So let me end here with final comment. Here we are in the present, gazing into the future of something Ezra had begun and infused with his spirit of communication, understanding, fostering of friendships, and even conflict mitigation and resolution. I'd like to end by looking back to a moment connected with Harvard's engagement with Asia, but it actually goes all the way back 10 to 15 million years ago. There are currently 2 species of a tulip tree that have been separated for 10 to 15 million years. One species in China called the Liriodendron chinense, and one in the US called the Liriodendron tulipifera. These were reunited in a rare hybrid at the Arnold Arboretum, which, as you can see, produces the most gorgeous flower. I can only think that this example drawn from botany would be just the type of story that Ezra Vogel, who was so concerned throughout his life with global understanding and cooperation as a way of overcoming misconceptions, mistrust, lingering historical enmity, and would have appreciated it as an optimistic lesson for U.S.-China relations, as well perhaps even of Sino-Japanese relationships, which was the subject of his last talk here in Nagoya. Indeed, it's no exaggeration to say that Ezra Vogel sowed the seeds for just such a flowering of relations throughout his long and distinguished career at Harvard, where he set the study of Asia at Harvard on a strong footing that carries on down to the present day. Thank you very much. ありがとうございます。
ロブソン先生、改めてありがとうございました。実は、数日前にですね、パワーポイントを意識をいただいて拝見する機会があったんですが、あまりにも、その歴史が、深くてですね、層が厚くて圧倒されまして、今日のお話もですね、そういう点でいくと大変感銘をいたしました。で、合わせて、改めて今日感じたのはですね、研究というとどうしてもその研究のことだけを考えるんですが、研究の組織を担う、あるいは研究の組織をリードする人材の養成が非常に大きな役割を果たしているなということを感じています。その点で学ぶところが大いにあったということで改めて感謝を申し上げます。